We begin a new story. I buried my husband in a simple grave because we couldn't afford anything more. He died worried about our debts. But the day after the funeral, a lawyer arrived carrying a briefcase. Your husband left you 20 million rubles, he said. But there's one condition. If these stories mean something to you, please subscribe. Your support means more to me than you can imagine. It's motivation. It's the reason I continue telling these stories. And write in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The November wind howled over the Volga like a wounded beast, cutting through the bare trees of the Arsk cemetery and piercing every layer of clothing wrapped around Ksenia Velichka. She stood at the edge of the fresh grave, pulling her black coat tightly around herself, watching as they lowered her husband into the frozen ground. Denis Latogorsky, 42 years old, had died from a heart attack so sudden that he was alive in the morning and gone by lunchtime. The cheap pine coffin creaked as the ropes lowered it down. Pine was the cheapest option. Ksenia felt her chest tighten because she knew Denis deserved better. But they had nothing left. They had debts. Behind her, the priest droned prayers in Church Slavonic, the words carried away by the wind. A small group of mourners huddled together nearby, neighbors, co-workers, a few distant friends. Ksenia's sister, Irina, stood closest to her, holding her arm. Irina's husband, Stepan Chermezin, stood behind them holding little Ruslan's hand. Ruslan was 7 years old. His small face showed confusion and fear. He didn't understand why his father was inside a box. That morning, he had asked, "Mom, will Dad come home after the funeral?" Ksenia had pulled him close and said nothing, because there were no words. The coffin hit the bottom of the grave. The cemetery workers lifted their shovels. The first clump of frozen dirt struck the wood with a dull thud. The sound was like a gunshot. Ksenia flinched. "He was a good man," Irina whispered. Ksenia nodded because it was true. Denis was good. Last winter, he had given his worn-out boots to a homeless man and walked home barefoot through the snow. He lent money they didn't have to friends who never paid him back. He never complained. Never blamed anyone, especially her. She thought about their apartment, the cracked linoleum floor, the rattling refrigerator, the cabinets that held nothing except buckwheat and canned food. She thought about the stack of bills hidden in the kitchen drawer. Nearly 400,000 rubles in debt. She remembered Denis's last words. "I'm sorry, Ksenia. I'm leaving you with nothing. I failed you." She had squeezed his hand and lied. "We'll be okay, Denis. Just rest." But they were not okay. They were drowning. And now she would have to survive alone. The priest finished the prayers. The mourners slowly began to leave. Stepan approached carrying Ruslan in his arms. The boy had fallen asleep against his uncle's shoulder. "We should go," Stepan said quietly. Ksenia looked one last time at the fresh grave. No monument. Just a simple wooden cross with Denis's name painted in black. Then she turned and walked away. She did not look back. The memorial gathering at Irina and Stepan's apartment in the Novosavanovsky district blurred together into a stream of faces and food. The old Soviet-era 5-story building felt warm despite the cold outside, filled with the smell of traditional dishes and strong black tea. Neighbors had been bringing food all morning. Kystybby stuffed with potatoes, golden and crispy. Chak-chak covered in honey, sticky and sweet. Piping hot meat paramyaki still sizzling from the pan. Pies with cabbage, pies with mushrooms, pies with every filling imaginable. That was tradition. People fed the grieving because they didn't know how else to help. Ksenia sat in the corner of the living room with Ruslan asleep on her lap, accepting condolences she barely heard. Faces passed in front of her one after another. The old woman from downstairs squeezed her hands and whispered prayers. Denis's construction foreman, red-faced and uncomfortable, shoved an envelope of money into her hands. A childhood friend of Denis, whom she hadn't seen in years, cried louder than anyone else in the apartment. Ksenia nodded. She thanked them. But later, she would remember none of it. Through the window, she could see the domes of the Kul Sharif Mosque darkening against the gray sky, a reminder that in Kazan, Tatar and Russian cultures were woven together like threads in a finely crafted carpet. Dennis loved that about their city. He often took Ruslan to see the mosque, the Kremlin, and the river. "This is your home," he would tell the boy. "All of it. Never forget that." Stepan approached carrying a plate of food Ksenia didn't want. "You need to eat, Ksenia." "I can't." He nodded with understanding. Stepan worked at Kazanorgsynts, one of the city's largest factories, and he had always treated Dennis like a brother. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, gone to the same school, dreamed about the same things. When Dennis's adoptive parents died in a car accident when he was 16, Stepan's family took him in. They were closer than blood relatives. "If you need anything," Stepan said quietly, "money, help with Ruslan, anything at all, ask immediately. Don't even think twice." "Your family," Ksenia whispered gratefully. But both of them knew no one could really help. The bills would keep coming. The debts would continue growing. And Dennis was gone. That night, after Irina took Ruslan to sleep in the spare room, Ksenia found herself alone in her own apartment for the first time since Dennis's death. The silence was unbearable. The apartment had always been small, but now it felt enormous, empty in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. She needed something to do. Anything. She couldn't just sit there and drown. She started with his clothes. The closet was tiny. Neither of them had ever owned much. She pulled out his work shirts, still carrying his scent, sweat, sawdust, and the cheap soap he always used. She pressed one against her face and breathed in the smell until she couldn't feel anything anymore. Then she found his wallet. It was old, sitting on his nightstand exactly where he had left it the night he died. The leather was cracked and peeling from years of use. He had owned it long before they met. She had offered many times to buy him a new one, for birthdays, anniversaries, but he always refused with a smile. "This one still works. It's got character. Just like me." Inside, she found a faded photo of Ruslan, worn soft from years of carrying it around. A subway card with 2 rides left. A receipt from their last grocery trip. 300 rubles in crumpled bills, his last cash. And a business card she had never seen before. It was hidden behind the photograph so carefully that Ksenia almost missed it. The card was thick, expensive, cream-colored, with elegant black lettering. The kind handed out in luxury offices downtown, not printed in cheap kiosks near the metro. Fyodor Vyazemsky. Attorney at law. Kazan, Kremlin Street. On the back, in Dennis's uneven handwriting, were the words, "If something happens to me." Ksenia stared at it for a long time. A lawyer. Dennis had never mentioned a lawyer. They couldn't afford lawyers. Lawyers were for people with property, disputes, things worth fighting over. She turned the card over in her hands as though it might reveal its secrets through touch alone. The paper was thick and expensive. The address was on Kremlin Street, the most prestigious street in Kazan, lined with historic buildings and luxury offices. What had Dennis been doing with a lawyer on Kremlin Street? She placed the card on the kitchen table and sat staring at it all night, watching snow pile against the windowsill while the apartment creaked around her. The radiator hissed. Somewhere in the building, a child cried, then slowly quieted down. Ksenia waited. The card lay before her like a question she could not answer. Like a secret her husband had carried into the grave. The knock came the next day at noon. Ksenia opened the door and saw a man in an expensive wool coat, his shoes polished to a mirror shine despite the slush covering the streets. He looked about 60 years old, with silver hair and observant eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Everything about him spoke of money, the cut of his coat, the watch on his wrist, the quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. Behind him at the curb sat a black Mercedes, its engine humming softly. The kind of car nobody in this neighborhood ever saw except in movies. Two neighbors peeked through their curtains, curious about the visitor. "Ksenia Velichka?" the man asked. His voice was soft but refined, marked by the accent of Moscow universities and old money. Not the speech of Kazan. He belonged to a completely different world. "Yes," she managed to say. "My name is Fyodor Vyazemsky. I was your husband's lawyer. May I come in?" She stepped aside, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. He entered the tiny apartment, ducking slightly beneath the low doorway. His eyes swept across the worn furniture, the cracked dishes drying beside the sink, the pile of unpaid bills on the table. His expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps sadness, or respect for a man who had chosen to live this way. He sat carefully on the edge of their sagging couch, the same couch with the spring poking out on the left side that Dennis had always promised to fix. Then he opened a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Ksenia earned in a month. Inside were documents. Many documents. Official folders sealed with wax stamps from the Kazan City Court and the Moscow Arbitration Court. "Mrs. Velichka," he began, "your husband retained my services approximately 15 years ago, shortly before marrying you. Since then, I have managed certain assets on his behalf. His instructions were very clear. Upon his death, I was to tell you everything. I regret that it must happen under such circumstances." Ksenia frowned. "Assets? What assets? We have nothing. We have debts. Look around you. This is all we have. This is all we've ever had." Mr. Vyazemsky slid a folder across the coffee table, the same table Dennis had built himself out of scrap wood because they couldn't afford to buy one. "Your husband's financial portfolio," the lawyer said calmly. "Estimated value, approximately 20 million rubles. Possibly more, considering recent market growth. The funds are distributed across accounts in Sberbank, VTB, and several European institutions in Switzerland and Luxembourg. Everything is completely legal. Everything properly documented. All taxes paid. I personally supervised every transaction for the last 15 years. The room began to spin. Ksenia gripped the arm of the couch. The world blurred before her eyes. 20 million rubles. The number meant nothing. And at the same time, it meant everything. It was money she could not even imagine. More than everyone on their street combined would earn in their entire lives. More than she could make in 1,000 years working at the clinic. "That's impossible," she whispered. "We lived paycheck to paycheck." He drove a taxi at night. He worried about every single ruble. He died apologizing for our debts. He died believing he had failed us. Mr. Vyazemsky nodded slowly, his expression gentle. "Yes. He was very specific about that. He instructed me never to reveal these assets during his lifetime. He wanted you to live a normal life, free from the pressure of wealth. He was afraid that if you knew, everything would change. Your relationships with people. Your priorities. Your sense of self. He wanted you to remain exactly who you are. He told me you were the most genuine person he had ever met, and he would not allow money to destroy that." Tears burned in Ksenia's eyes. He watched me struggle. He watched me cry over bills. He watched me count coins just to buy bread. And all that time, he had millions. "He had millions of rubles saved for you," the lawyer corrected softly. "For your future. For Ruslan's education. For your retirement. For the life he wanted to provide after he was gone. He sacrificed himself so you would never have to. Every extra job he worked, every bonus, every gift, all of it went into this fund. He lived modestly so that after his death, his family would never know hunger or cold. He once told me that wearing old boots was a small price to pay for knowing his family would always be warm and fed." Ksenia couldn't breathe. She thought of Dennis in his worn-out boots, stuffing newspaper into the holes in the soles. Dennis eating cold buckwheat for dinner because he gave the hot food to Ruslan. Dennis working double shifts and coming home so exhausted that he sometimes fell asleep at the kitchen table still wearing his coat. He had been protecting her, not from poverty, but from wealth. But where did it come from, she demanded, her voice breaking. 20 million rubles doesn't just appear. Dennis never earned that kind of money. He worked construction. He drove a taxi. He made maybe 30,000 rubles a month. 40 on a good month. Mr. Vyazemsky folded his hands on his knees. That, he said quietly, is what I must explain. The money did not come from Dennis. It came from his biological father. A man he never met. A man who died without ever seeing him in person. Fyodor Vyazemsky told the story slowly and carefully, as though handling something infinitely fragile. He spoke for nearly an hour, pausing from time to time so Ksenia could absorb each revelation, cry, and ask questions. Denis Latigorsky had been adopted as an infant. His biological mother, a young woman named Karina Ostrovskaya, had left him at orphanage number 3 in Kazan. She was unmarried, poor, and believed he deserved a better life than she could give him. The surname Zlatigorsky came from the adoptive parents who raised him, kind people who later died in a car accident when Denis was 16, leaving him alone for the second time in his life. His biological father was a man named Gleb Arsenievich Zlatigorsky. He had no connection to the adoptive family. The shared surname was merely a coincidence, one Denis had always found strange. Gleb was a successful oil trader in Moscow, wealthy beyond imagination, with apartments in London and villas in Sochi. But he never knew Karina was pregnant. She disappeared from his life before he could learn the truth, ashamed of her circumstances and afraid he would reject her. Years later, when Denis was 25 and working construction, Gleb hired a private investigator to find the son he never knew existed. He had been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer, and he wanted to make amends. He wanted to see his son, explain everything, ask for forgiveness. The investigator found Denis living in a rented room in Kazan, working 12-hour shifts, just beginning his life. But Gleb died before they could meet. 3 days before the planned visit, he passed away alone in a Moscow hospital, surrounded only by lawyers. However, his will had already been prepared and filed with the Moscow City Court. In it, he left Denis Latigorsky his entire fortune, approximately 20 million rubles, with one condition. Mr. Vyazemsky removed the original will from the folder, yellowed with age, bearing Moscow court seals and signatures. Your husband's father believed sudden wealth destroys people, the lawyer explained. He had seen it happen to friends, business partners, and their children. He wanted Denis to build his own life first. To know hardship. To learn the value of love and hard work. Only after Denis's death would the money pass to his family through the trust structure I managed. He wrote a letter explaining his reasoning. Denis read it and accepted the condition. Ksenia stared at the document. So Denis knew. For 15 years, he knew about this money and never told me. Yes, the lawyer answered quietly. And it was his choice. He could have challenged the will in court. He could have accessed the money sooner. But after reading his father's letter, he agreed to the terms. He wanted to marry you without money influencing anything. He wanted to know you loved him for who he was, not for what he could give you. He wanted to build a real life, not a purchased one. Ksenia remembered their wedding at the civil registry office on Profsoyuzhnaya Street. No honeymoon. A simple white dress borrowed from Irina and altered by hand. A small celebration in a friend's apartment with store-bought cakes and cheap Soviet champagne. And Denis had smiled through all of it as though it was exactly the life he wanted. He once told me, Ksenia whispered through tears, that I was the best thing that ever happened to him. I thought he was just being sweet. I thought he was trying to comfort me because of how poor we were. He meant every word, Mr. Vyazemsky said. I met with him once a year at a cafe on Bauman Street. He always talked about you. About Ruslin. About how proud he was of the life you built together. He showed me photographs, your son's first steps, your anniversary, the rocking chair he built for you when you were pregnant. To him, the money was only a promise for the future. For later. Ksenia broke down sobbing, covering her face with her hands. 15 years. 15 years of struggle, fear, and watching the man she loved work himself beyond exhaustion. And all because he loved her too much to let money change them. He carried that secret alone. Never complaining. Never hinting at it. Never using it to comfort himself. When she was finally able to speak again after many long minutes of tears and silence, Ksenia asked the question that had been growing in her mind the entire time. You said there was a condition in the will. What is it? Mr. Vyazemsky removed another envelope, sealed with dark red wax and addressed in handwriting she instantly recognized as Denis's, careful and deliberate, like everything he did. The paper was thick and expensive, nothing like the cheap notepads he used at work. There is one final requirement in the will, the lawyer said. You must deliver this letter, along with part of the inheritance, half the amount, 10 million rubles, to a woman named Yana Cheremezina. She lives in a small settlement outside Kazan called Vysokaya Gora. Does that name mean anything to you? Ksenia shook her head, confused. Cheremezin was her sister's married surname. But Yana? She had never heard of anyone named Yana in Stepan's family. His mother's name was Galina. His sisters were Natasha and Olga. No Yana. She is Denis's biological mother, Mr. Vyazemsky said quietly. Karina Ostrovskaya changed her name many years ago after marrying a man named Cheremezin. She lives in poverty in Vysokaya Gora, alone, believing her son wanted nothing to do with her. Denis found her 5 years ago with the help of the same detective his father had hired. He visited her twice at a tea house near the Kazan Kremlin. He didn't tell you because he was afraid it would complicate everything. He feared you would immediately want to help her, and then he would have to explain the money. Ksenia's thoughts spun wildly. He had met her. He knew his real mother and never said a word. For 5 years. He kept it secret from her too, the lawyer continued. He only wanted to know her. To forgive her. Everything is explained in the letter. He also left her a smaller amount in his personal will. Enough for her to live comfortably. The 10 million from his father's inheritance was Gleb's wish, to provide for the woman who gave birth to his son. Gleb wrote about her in his letter to Denis. He said he had once loved her and wanted her taken care of. Ksenia looked down at the envelope in her hands. It felt heavier than it should have. Sealed for years, waiting for this exact moment. Why didn't he tell me, she whispered. I would have understood. I would have gone with him. I would have accepted her. Mr. Vyazemsky smiled sadly. He knew that. But he also knew you would have wanted to help her immediately. And he couldn't explain how without revealing everything. He was waiting for the right moment. He always said he would tell you once Ruslan was older, when the time finally came. He simply ran out of time. The next morning, Ksenia drove east from Kazan, past the industrial outskirts and into the flat, snow-covered countryside of Tatarstan. The sky was gray, the road slick with ice, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were filled with Denis, his smile, his worn-out boots, his secrets. The settlement of Vysokaya Gora sat on a small hill about 30 minutes from the city. Tiny wooden houses lined the main road, their windows glowing warmly against the November cold. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the smell of firewood and fresh bread. House number 14 stood at the end of a narrow lane, a weathered building with a crooked porch and a bare winter garden. An elderly woman opened the door. She looked around 65 years old. Her face was lined by hardship, her hands rough and red from years of labor. But her eyes. The eyes were Denis's. The same warm brown eyes. The same kindness hidden behind caution. Yes? The woman asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Ksenia held out the envelope with trembling hands. My husband, your son, asked me to give this to you. Yana Cheremezina stared at the envelope. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then her worn hand slowly reached forward and took it, trembling so badly she could barely hold it. She read the letter right there in the doorway, standing in the cold while tears streamed down her face. Ksenia watched the older woman's knees weaken. She grabbed the doorframe to steady herself and pressed the letter against her chest as if it were something sacred. When she finally finished reading, she looked at Ksenia with an expression of such raw grief and gratitude that Ksenia felt tears sting her own eyes. "He forgave me," Yana whispered in Russian with a soft Tatar accent. "He said he understood. He said he loved me. He said I did the right thing by giving him up. He said he had a good life. Because of me." Ksenia nodded as tears flowed freely down her face. "Yes. He had one. He was the kindest man I ever knew. He never held anger toward anyone. He simply loved. That's all he knew how to do." They stood together beneath the falling snow, two women connected by their love for the same man. One had given him life. The other had shared his life. Yana reached out and took Ksenia's cold hand in her own warm, rough one. "Come inside," she said softly. "It's cold. I'll make tea, and you can tell me about my son." Months passed. The snow melted, and spring came to Kazan. The Volga broke free from the ice, and the city came alive again. Ksenia used the inheritance to pay off every debt. She bought a good apartment in central Kazan near the Kremlin, with high ceilings, large windows, and reliable heating. She enrolled Ruslin in one of the city's best schools. And she bought a small warm house for Yana in Vysokaya Gora, close enough for weekend visits. The house had a garden where Yana could grow vegetables, a new stove that didn't fill the rooms with smoke, and a bedroom overlooking the hills. The elderly woman became a beloved grandmother to Ruslin, a gift Dennis had arranged without ever saying a word. She taught the boy Tatar folk songs, showed him how to cook traditional paramyaki, and told stories about the village where she grew up. Ruslin, who had missed his father so deeply, slowly began to find joy again. He called her Baba Yana and drew pictures for her at school. Irina and Stepan welcomed Yana into the family without hesitation. "She's family," Stepan simply said. "That's all that matters." Every Sunday, no matter the weather, Ksenia drove to the Arsk cemetery. She stood before Dennis's grave, which now had a proper monument, black granite with gold lettering. She brought fresh flowers and told him about their son, about Yana, about the life his sacrifice had made possible. "Now I understand," she whispered one cold November afternoon exactly 1 year after his funeral. "You gave me everything. You just made me wait for it." She thought about the years of struggle, the nights filled with worry, the simple life they had lived together. And she realized something. He had given her something even more valuable than money. A real marriage, built on love instead of comfort. Ksenia walked back toward the car, where Ruslin and Yana were waiting for her. Through the window, she could see them laughing together about something, grandson and grandmother, connected by blood and love. And somewhere, Ksenia believed, Dennis was smiling too. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with your loved ones, and subscribe to the channel.